A Critique of the Philosophy of Progress by Lyle, Lanier. 1. Progress is both a slogan and a philosophy, a device for social control and a belief in the reality of a process of cosmic development toward some far-off divine event. The idea has been vigorously assailed as a superstition or a myth, and has been defended with equal energy as an aspect of the natural necessity of the world. Materialists and idealists alike have adopted it as a Weltanschauung. Both skeptics and theologians have denounced it as an aberrant delusion. John Dewey believes that modern industrial technology provides us with a method for securing progress and for preserving our culture against decline. Oswald Spengler looks on industrialism and its concomitant manifestations as evidence of decay in the spirit of Western life. Sociologists have struggled with the notion of progress for a long time, and for the most part have adopted an agnostic attitude. They have failed to find either a satisfactory definition of progress or any criterion to determine whether or not a specific social change is really progressive in any final sense. The agnostic attitude would seem to be the only sensible one, in view of such conflicting views, were it not for the fact that in contemporary America the doctrine of progress is of immense social consequence. Modern industrialism has found the use of progress as a super slogan, very efficacious as a public anesthetic. The magic word is even imprinted on the automobile license plates of one of our advancing states, thus recalling the charms used in primitive cultures. Progress is perhaps the most widely advertised commodity offered for general consumption in our high-powered century, a sort of universal social enzyme whose presence is essential to the ready assimilation of other commodities, material and intellectual, generated by the machine age. A steady barrage of propaganda issues through newspapers, magazines, radios, billboards, and other agencies for controlling public opinion, to the effect that progress must be maintained. It requires little sagacity to discover that progress usually turns out to mean business, or else refers to some activity which serves to allay the qualms of the business conscience. General sanction of industrial exploitation of the individual is grounded in the firm belief on the part of the generality of people that the endless production and consumption of material goods means prosperity, a high standard of living, progress, or any one among several other catchwords. The conviction that our noisy social ferment portends progressive development towards some highly desired but always undesignated goal is perhaps the central psychological factor in the maintenance of our top-heavy industrial superstructure. This belief is strengthened by certain popular interpretations of the spirit of America, which proclaim a mystic faith in the industrial destiny. With a rather complete disregard of specific economic and social trends, authors of this inspirational criticism conjure up a magic venturesomeness of spirit, which they expect to well up momently in sturdy breasts and automatically bend economic forces to its will. They derive vicarious feeling of power and importance from acquiescence in what they feel to be the mighty trend of progress, encouraged in many instances by the designing notice conferred upon them by dominant business leaders. Such acquiescence, curiously enough, is experienced as real casual efficiency, being transformed into an illusion of leadership or a sense of prophecy. This romanticized type of rationalization of industrialism might be ignored were it not for the fact that it tends to confirm the confused business mind in its false sense of security, and thus impedes the development of a sound program of economic and social adjustment. Such considerations as these suggest that neither social science nor social philosophy can afford to ignore the problems presented by the hypostatization and misuse of the questionable concept of progress. The measure of social control secured through the use of that modern magic, advertising, necessitates an evaluation of the ends which such mass suggestion aims to secure. As Dewey has pointed out, the instability in a social order which renders its members susceptible to control of this facile manner is dangerous, since sooner or later exploitation will run its course, with the probable result that the masses will be activated with equal ease against their present dominators. Hence, the analysis of the notion of progress and the study of the uses to which it is put are not mere academic or abstract problems. They are immediate, concrete issues for a social philosophy which would relate its thought to the evaluation of the social and moral ideas of its time, and for a comprehensive social science which would deal intelligently with the effects of such ideas on human economy. The problem of progress really coincides with what Windelband has called the problem of civilization, which asks the question, quote, whether and how far the change in human impulses and in the relations of human life has served to further the modern order and man's true happiness. End of quote. The fact of change is unquestioned, but has there been progress? Even if there is little chance of arriving at any conclusive factual determination as to the reality of the phenomenon, the issue should be clarified by an attempt to evaluate the idea in terms of its historical development, its normative implications, and the relationship between the latter and such social phenomena as are relevant to them. 2. Progress is a comparatively modern idea. The chronological succession of events meant little or nothing to the Greeks, as far as having any cumulative significance in terms of progress towards some end was concerned. Man and the human race were but episodes in the world process, which repeated itself forever according to like laws. Greek thinkers attempted to discover the nature of the abiding essence, which manifested itself in these eternal cycles. They had no philosophy of history, saw no meaning in history as such. It was not until the Hellenistic Roman period that a definite philosophy of history appeared, based upon the doctrines of Christianity. Man was regarded as a personality endowed with freedom and convicted of sin. His earthly sojourn was a period in which he should purge himself of sin through faith, in order to return to heaven at the end of it. The doctrine of the temporal finitude of the earth, with corporeal resurrection as a culmination, marks probably the first attempt on the part of man to conceive the flux of events historically or teleologically. But this teleology has no affinity with our modern progress, for it was based upon a belief in the innate depravity of man's nature and upon a denial of all value to earthly life. The Church, which alone survived the downfall of the Roman Empire, dominated the intellectual, political, and religious life of Western Europe for about 1,000 years. There was little evidence during this period of a shift in interest from other worldliness to progress of the human race in this world. Scholastic philosophy identified the search for truth with the attempt to rationalize church dogma, and as a consequence, the teleology of history remained largely a matter of Christian theology. There was little knowledge of Greek science, and the schooling of the Middle Ages was largely formal and dialectical. Interest in nature was necessarily stifled by a philosophy which renounced the world. The barrenness of scholastic learning could not fail to irk men of an empirical turn of mind, as well as those inclined toward speculative philosophy and mysticism. Roger Bacon was in a sense a concretion of the spirit of dissatisfaction with scholasticism, and his scientific studies presaged its downfall. Although some 3 centuries were to elapse between Bacon's work and the true scientific revival of the 16th century, there was nevertheless during this period a growing interest in nature and science, encouraged by the study of Aristotle's works on physics and by the Arabian schools of Spain. This interest is reflected in the great development of magical means of controlling or forecasting natural events, as manifested especially in the pseudosciences of astrology and alchemy. The revival of letters in the 15th century accelerated the process whereby the Church lost control of Western thought and prepared the way for a philosophy favorable to views of terrestrial progress. According to Windelband, quote, "The philosophy of the Renaissance is in the main the history of the process in which the natural science mode of regarding the world is gradually worked out from the humanistic renewal of Greek philosophy." End of quote. Renaissance philosophy reflects the discovery of Greek civilization on the one hand and the excitement generated by scientific and geographical discoveries on the other. Columbus's voyage to America, Magellan's tour around the world, providing the hypothesis that the world is a globe, the astronomical works of Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo, and numerous studies in mathematics, physics, and biology fired Renaissance thinkers with an intense zeal for knowledge about nature. Furthermore, and what is equally important for our purpose, these events were productive of a metaphysical view of the world, which, in a sense, would seem to underlie all doctrines of progress, namely, the principle of immanence, which Hegel considered the ruling philosophical thought of the modern world. The notion of a transcendent God, apart from and perhaps indifferent to nature, was replaced by a view which in some sense identified the two. Weber believes that the Copernican astronomy, which placed the sun at the center of the universe and located the earth among the planets, was the primary source of this notion, inasmuch as the conception of an infinite universe destroyed the traditional distinction between heaven and earth. This introduced grave incompatibilities between church doctrine and the theories of Renaissance scientists and philosophers. The fate of Bruno illustrates how serious the conflict was. The essential result of these momentous changes, for our purpose, is embodied in the philosophy of Francis Bacon. Bacon is the precursor of the spirit of modern life. It is from him that we may, in a sense, date the pragmatic, progressive temper. He regarded the philosophy of the Greeks as puerile, talkative rather than generative, fruitful in controversies, and barren in effects. He believed that contemplative or theoretical knowledge was largely responsible for what he considered the intellectual sterility of the Middle Ages. In opposition to the Aristotelian logic of demonstration, which implied that knowledge consisted simply in bringing together a universal truth and a particular fact of observation, Bacon insisted that effective knowledge could be gained only by a careful study of the processes of nature. Such knowledge would be instrumental. It would be a means by which man could secure dominion over the world. Its validity would be judged by its effectiveness in producing progress, meaning by the latter the improvement of man's material and social welfare. This is indeed a new teleology as compared with that of the Middle Ages. Man henceforth would be concerned not so much with saving his soul as with making himself comfortable, and with improvement of the world through cooperative social effort. Pragmatism, instrumentalism, positivism find a hearty progenitor in Bacon. The latter part of the 17th century and the entire 18th century were marked by an intense interest in man, in social institutions, in morals, all of which served to prepare the way for more explicitly formulated notions of human progress. Institutions and customs were no longer regarded as self-justifying. They were subjected to critical, rational analysis, with a view of determining their efficiency in promoting the happiness of individuals. There was a decided interest in psychology, beginning with Descartes and Hobbes, and in the psychological basis of society and morals. The general result of the social philosophy of this period is best represented in the utilitarian theory of moral action. This view holds that an action is ethically pleasing in proportion as it secures or aims to secure the greatest happiness for the greatest number of individuals. Virtue is measured by social utility. Although the general enlightenment of the period was restricted primarily to the upper classes, Nevertheless, there was a development of self-consciousness, so to speak, on the part of the masses, a movement which received articulate expression in the French Revolution. In general, there was a tendency towards emancipation from the past, an attempt to settle the problems of man's nature and destiny in a purely abstract fashion, and apart from the, quote, vital force of historical reality, end of quote, Windelband. This break with history was not restricted to social philosophy. In metaphysics and theology, we find deism, a doctrine of an impersonal nature substituted by many thinkers for the usual positive religions based upon belief in a personal God. The positivistic spirit of British and French thought in the 18th century was met towards its close by German idealism. Kant's critical philosophy rejected the purely empirical doctrine of knowledge advocated by the sensationalistic school and emphasized the organizing power of the mind itself as a determiner of the phenomenal world and of values, both moral and aesthetic. This work paved the way for the metaphysical systems of Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. It is in Hegel that we find the most systematic expression of what we have held to be the logical basis of all doctrines of progress, namely the idea of immanence. Reality for Hegel is world process, the evolution of which proceeds from indeterminate being, primitive, formless matter, to the human organism, which in its realization of the ideals of art, religion, and philosophy becomes absolute mind. He is the first thinker to formulate a complete philosophy of history. His system is a synthesis of all manifestations of reality, past, present, and future. This rationalization of all historical phenomena as the realization of the dialectic of logical development is in a way a doctrine of progress, a theory of evolution, although it has nothing in common with later positivistic and evolutionary theories. Hegel deduced the course of events from a priori principles, and although his philosophy of history played an important role in the development of German nationalism, his abstract theory was to be replaced by another doctrine of evolution which would appeal to the imagination of men inclined to think materialistically, and which for a long time seemed to provide intellectual sanction for the belief in progress. German metaphysics did not alter very materially the course of development of the natural sciences throughout the 19th century, nor did the interests of social philosophy abate. To some extent, indeed, the influence of German idealism was added to that of utilitarianism in the production of social reform, especially in England. But developments in the natural sciences, mechanical inventions which made possible the utilization of physical energy on a large scale, a conception of social progress defined in terms of improvement in the material conditions of living for the masses, and the doctrine of the natural rights of mankind. All these were the essential factors which combined to change the social, economic, and political organization of the Western world from the close of the 18th century onward. Curiously enough, the trend toward democracy, which really began with the Renaissance and culminated in a sense at the close of the 18th century in the formation of the American and French republics, was now complicated by a counter-influence in the form of the Industrial Revolution. We say counter-influence because the political democracy of these republics was based upon an agrarian economy, upon an industrialism which permitted great personal autonomy in the conduct of all phases of living, and which at the same time promoted social stability through attachment, in one form or another, to land. This agrarian economy, which lay at the base of European and American social structure down to the close of the 18th century, was disrupted by industrialism, with its urbanization, shifting population, abnormal concentration of wealth, panics, unemployment, labor unions, and a train of attendant phenomena. The stream of goods from the machines, the drive for ever-increasing production and consumption, and the generally accelerated tempo of social change served to popularize the doctrine of progress. Visions of an endless upward sweep of democracy, in which every individual would share increasingly in profits from glamorous industries, and have more and more mechanical luxuries to enjoy, intoxicated the pliant imaginations of people loosened from traditional social moorings. The dominant note of 19th century thought was naturalism, in the form either of positivism or of materialism. There was, to be sure, a strong idealistic opposition in Germany, the aftermath of Kant and the great metaphysical systems, and to a lesser extent in England and America, but philosophies based upon natural science conceptions of phenomena tended to predominate, at least numerically. Positivism may be considered a refinement of Bacon's philosophy. The view is best presented in the philosophy of Auguste Comte, who held that the history of human thought, as well as the history of each positive science, passed through three stages: the theological, the metaphysical, and the positive. The theological stage is characterized by the tendency to explain the world anthropomorphically. In the metaphysical stage, explanation takes the form of abstractions considered as intelligent realities. The positive stage dispenses with all necessity for finding efficient causes of phenomena and regards invariable laws of recurrence as sufficient both for practical and for philosophical purposes. As applied historically and socially, Comte believed that positivism meant the ultimate triumph of industrialism with social control in the hands of the proletariat. Influenced, no doubt, by Hegel, Comte viewed historical and social phenomena as connected with the same necessity as physical and biological phenomena, and thought that their laws could be discovered by the application of the positive method of inquiry. The influence of Hegel and Comte is shown in the social philosophy of Karl Marx, who formulated a system of economic determinism, construing the Hegelian dialectic in terms of class conflict. Paralleling the work of Marx, the writings of Feuerbach, Dühring, and Strauss reveal a realistic conception of progress as an aspect of the natural necessity of the material world. Their materialistic leanings led them to a fatalistic optimism. They regarded pessimism as a romantic vestige of Christianity, which held the world to be evil. But this brings us to the theory of evolution, which generated or appeared to substantiate not only the doctrine of progress, but also most of the materialistic philosophy of the 19th century. Although the notion of progress did not originate with the theory of cosmic evolution, as we have already shown, nevertheless, this theory was thought for a long time to justify the belief in progress. Spencer explicitly affirmed its reality and conceived the process as the evolution of the simple into the complex. This law of evolutionary progress was believed to operate throughout the entire realm of nature, whether in the development of the earth, or life, or society, of government, manufacturing, commerce, language, art, or whatnot. The universe was held to be an unknowable force, which manifested itself in this peculiar form of differentiation of the homogeneous into the heterogeneous. Evolution necessarily meant a change for the better, the fact of survival constituting sufficient reason for a phenomenon's existence and worth. Along with this view of progress, Spencer held to a hedonistic theory of action, claiming that if an animal consistently followed a painful course of action, it would soon cease to exist. He recognized, however, that pleasure and progress do not always coincide, and his hedonism came to be considerably modified in his definition of the highest conduct as that which conduces to the, quote, greatest breadth, length, and completeness of human life. End of quote. The highest stage in evolution is that reached when conduct simultaneously achieves the greatest totality of life in itself, in offspring, and in fellow man. It requires little penetration to see that this goal is one which the process of evolution has been somewhat deficient, for the most part, in realizing. Such a naive ethical determinism as is implied in this theory of evolution is no longer seriously held by social philosophers, although something of its spirit prevails in contemporary popular thought. The evolutionary hypothesis has undoubtedly exercised considerable influence upon the course of civilization since the middle of the 19th century, particularly in its conflict with religious beliefs. But this influence, although carrying with it expressed theories of progress, had no direct economic concomitant, and consequently has probably played little role as an instrument of social control. It has contributed, of course, to the loosening of emotional ties which bound Western people to the past, but its role is a minor one when compared with the effects of industrialism. The conquest of the West by machine technology produced social consequences without parallel in history. But it is not perhaps a matter of coincidence that toward the end of the 19th century, when the positivistic spirit wrought out such victories over nature, these endeavors should receive philosophic expression in the form of pragmatism. William James, with whom the latter movement is generally associated, was not a defender of the industrialism of his time. His attitude toward the social practices of his era, the so-called Gilded Age in America, was not that of acquiescence, as Mr. Mumford has tried to show. Indeed, he reacted strongly against it. But his pragmatic theory of truth and his metaphysical pluralism, with the further hypothesis of an open world, a universe not closed but indeterminate and in the making, were congenial both to the spirit of practicality of his time and to the popular notion of the upward sweep of human progress. Causal relationships are difficult to establish, but without doing violence to fact, one can say that in an age without fixed standards, with a flux of changing institutions and beliefs, with a vision of endless progress, James propounded a philosophy of relativism, practicality, and an indeterminate universe. Perhaps the best interpretation is to view both James and his age as resultants of 3 centuries of Baconianism, the one in theory and the other in fact. And as one finds a wide discrepancy between the personality and teachings of James and the concrete social processes of his time, so one may perhaps expect generally to find considerable divergence between the abstract relativism of a highly moral character and the practical social consequences of relativism for humanity at large. James was not especially concerned with social philosophy. His interest, like that of Emerson, was in human experience. His rejection of traditionalism, formal logic, institutionalism in any form, was largely grounded in his romantic belief in the validity of the intuitive immediacy of volitional experience. It is to John Dewey that we must turn to find how the pragmatic spirit deals with concrete social problems. All philosophy, according to Dewey, is social philosophy, whose task should be to, quote, clarify men's ideas as to the social and moral strifes of their own day, end of quote. Philosophic rationalization should take the form of defining specific social ends. Thought should be utilized in the realization of purposes by which life is liberalized and expanded. Dewey's general philosophic viewpoint is known as instrumentalism, a word which appears to have many meanings, but which in the most general sense seems to imply that all human institutions and activities are, or should be, instrumental in the realization of moral values. The highest aim of society is, quote, to set free and develop the capacities of human individuals without respect to race, sex, class, or economic status, end of quote. 3. Mr. Dewey's philosophy initiates a new era in the development of the notion of progress. He has no interest in the absolutistic metaphysical theories, in which progress is a corollary of the system of abstractions by which they seek to comprehend the universe. Nor does the theory of evolution appear to lend positive support to the belief in progress. The vague analogies between biological and social development are suggestive, but not convincing. There is another set of factors, however, which Mr. Dewey regards as of genuine importance. The changes in social organization and ideas, and the developments in scientific technology, traced very inadequately in the preceding pages, are at least pertinent to the issue. They represent a reaction against absolutism, both in social institutions and in intellectual endeavor, and this is held to be a necessary condition of progress, even if it does not automatically ensure its realization. Inasmuch as Mr. Dewey's general philosophic position centers about problems of democracy, education, scientific and industrial technology, and the significance of these for progress, it will be profitable to examine his views on these questions. The historic formula of democracy, liberty, equality, fraternity, is rationalized by Dewey in terms of his pluralistic metaphysics and his theory of social values. Liberty means, quote, a universe in which there is real uncertainty and contingency, a world in which all is not in and never will be, a world which is in some respects incomplete and in the making, and which in these respects may be made this way or that, according as men judge, prize, love, and labor. End of quote. Liberty is not freedom to act in accordance with an immutable law, for the latter implies a fixed, closed world, a world in which progress and human endeavor have no real meaning. Equality means, similarly, that the world is not a fixed, hierarchical order of grades of human excellence. Quote, it means that every existence deserving the name of existence has something unique and irreplaceable about it, that it does not exist to illustrate a principle, to realize a universal, or to embody a kind or class. It embodies, so to speak, a metaphysical mathematics of the incommensurable in which each speaks for itself and demands consideration on its own behalf. End of quote. Fraternity means the interaction and association of such equal individuals without limit. Quote, to say what is specific and unique can be exhibited and become forceful or actual only in relationship with other like beings is merely, I take it, to give a metaphysical version to the fact that democracy is concerned not with freaks or geniuses, or heroes or divine leaders, but with associated individuals in which each by intercourse with others somehow makes the life of each more distinctive. End of quote. This is a metaphysical rendering of communism, or socialism, which, in some form, Mr. Dewey has advocated for years as the only political and social system in which real moral values could be secured. For such a system implies, he thinks, communion, shared goods, shared experiences, liberation of capacity through intercourse. The industrial technology is an important agency through which these desiderata could be realized, for it facilitates commerce and exchange of ideas. It breaks down feudal intellectual barriers, class distinctions, and traditions. Thus, the industrial processes fulfill an educational function, inasmuch as Dewey conceives education to be a process in which the distinctive aptitudes in art, thought, and companionship are released to a maximum degree in each individual. Let it be understood at once that Mr. Dewey has no illusions about the extent to which these ideal conditions have been realized in our present era of industrialism. The tremendous social changes since the Renaissance have broken down the barriers which have kept human society static, he thinks. They have provided an opportunity for progress, but this opportunity has not been realized. The bewildering spectacle of the changes has unfortunately been confused with progress. It would be difficult, we read in his latest essays, to find an epoch in history as lacking in solid and assured objects of belief and approved ends of action as the present. It is indeed refreshing to note his strictures upon our economic anarchy after being deluged with the puerile mouthings of would-be scholars about the spiritualism of modern business. The cause of the present disorder Mr. Dewey locates in the fact that there is a fundamental dualism between the individual's motivation to action and the means by which his action is executed. That is to say, an individual's motives are unmitigatedly private, whereas the means of his action are corporate and collective. This motivation is the counterpart of an earlier individualism, which is out of place in a corporate age. This individualism was natural in an agrarian society, where there was considerable isolation and personal autonomy in the conduct of life, but such a spirit has no place in a machine age where the conditions make for an aggregate mental and emotional life. Hence, we need, according to Dewey, to inhabit the principles and standards that are merely traditional, opinions and ideals that have no living relationship to the situation in which we live, and attempt to achieve a new individualism. The latter will be a function of the socialistic state, in which there is collective control over the processes and results of corporate enterprise. This collective participation would mean not only an equitable distribution of profits, but would mean an attachment to the process of industrialism of such a nature that the use of thought and emotion would not be excluded from the individual's daily work. This would produce an individual as much related and unified as the present individual is divided and distracted. When we begin thus to utilize the resources of technology for purposes avowedly social, we can talk about progress. The picture drawn by Mr. Dewey of the fundamental disorder of the contemporary mind is admirable. His disgust with the nauseating idealism, which ignores or misrepresents the concrete cultural scene in America, is undoubtedly justified. Equally commendable is the criticism of those individuals who attempt to insulate themselves against contemporary vulgarity with an artificial and alien culture. There are, however, certain rather fundamental propositions involved in Mr. Dewey's remedial measures, which, to the writer at least, are not at all self-evident. In the first place, the assumption that socialism or communism is a desirable or even possible basis of human society needs considerably more evidence than the logical considerations which impel Mr. Dewey to suggest it. Some form of socialism has often been advocated as a panacea for the evils of current economic and political systems. It seems such a plausible method for dealing with one of the major ethical issues of the human race, namely the tendency to exploit other individuals. Systems of slavery or domination in some form constitute one of the outstanding facts of history. Our contemporary variety is perhaps as complete and vicious as any form of outright ownership, for there is no feeling of responsibility, even for the physical welfare of individuals dependent for a living upon the caprice of modern industry. A logical method of abolishing this unethical system would seem to be the communistic state, based upon a metaphysics of equality and upon patterns of economic, political, and social participation by all individuals in all forms of activity. Unfortunately, logical cogency is no criterion of empirical practicability in the realm of social reorganization. The utopias of the 17th and 18th centuries illustrate the futility of trying to deal with social problems in an abstract fashion, apart from historical and psychological realities. And socialism is another utopia, despite the superficial similarity between many of its proposed features and the forms of economic enterprise in our corporate age. It is this resemblance which suggests to Mr. Dewey that in the mechanisms of industry as they exist in America, we have an economic framework which would be essential to the socialistic order. In fact, he asserts that we are in for some kind of socialism whether or not we like it, and that our choice must be between a socialism that is public and one that is capitalistic. The latter, however, is not socialism at all, as Mr. Dewey would probably grant. His term economic anarchy is a better description. As a matter of fact, the corporate form of our economic system makes possible a scale of exploitation unheard of in history. The industrial technology which Mr. Dewey exalts so highly is a two-edged sword. Theoretically, it might appear to be the mechanism by which the ideal collective existence could be consummated. Actually, it is a form of legerdemain through which a stupendous concentration of wealth and power is achieved, along with a corresponding degree of exploitation of human effort. Centralization of political power and governmental regulation of industrial processes, far from being tendencies towards any real socialism, offer even greater possibilities of economic domination because of the comparative ease with which control of government agencies is secured by industrial interests. In spite of these adverse consequences of the corporate regime, Mr. Dewey believes that public socialism is possible, even though we should have to remake human nature to secure it. One is forced to ask if attempts to remake human nature are not largely responsible for our present disorganization. Is there not perhaps in man a grain against which the artificial constraint of social patterns cannot successfully go? Are not all systems of socialism likely to founder on just the complex of human tendencies, which make for what Mr. Dewey calls the, quote, old individualism, end quote? Remaking human nature in any fundamental sense is a process of very dubious prospect, even if the desirability of it is granted. Man is not a tabula rasa on which arbitrary patterns of conduct may be inscribed without regard to his natural propensities. His bodily organization at birth prescribes the general limits within which not only his overt forms of action, but also the dependable motives through which he can be stimulated will tend to lie. The latter factors are especially important and are perhaps less variable than the former. The neuromuscular glandular systems which underlie affective behavior and which organize to energize the individual cannot be excised or fundamentally modified by social patterns. Man is remarkably plastic in the sense that he possesses few, if any, complex instinctive pattern recognitions at birth, but there are structural conditions determining his organic needs, as well as the energizing mechanisms important in affective and emotional reactions closely related to those needs, which are largely due to innate conditions and which are relatively stable. Such direction of man's overt habit formation as may be secured by education must conform rather than run counter to these conditions if we are to secure any integration of the individual's efforts and aspirations into a unitary personality. The old individualism was perhaps not at all an aberrant condition. It is more intelligible when regarded as a natural product, in its general features, of those tendencies in man which are most fundamental, most dynamic, and the inhibition of which can be expected to produce distortion of human development. Man's motivation to action will no doubt forever be unmitigatedly private in a basic sense, and any plan for social readjustment will do well to proceed on this basis. Such motivation is not necessarily unethical in nature, although antisocial tendencies may predominate in many individuals where the environment is such as to fail to provide conditions essential to a stable, well-rounded development. A second important implication of Mr. Dewey's proposed collectivism relates to the means of securing social direction and action. In conformity with the metaphysics of equality and uniqueness of individuality, Mr. Dewey seems to rely upon a kind of collective generation and expression of group purposes and ideals, rather than upon geniuses, heroes, or divine leaders, i.e., superior individuals. There is an implied hope that somehow the greater association among individuals, which does not, in fact, occur, as will be shown below, and the consequent release of capacities to a maximum degree will result in the articulation of ethically approved goals and in the discovery of practical means of realizing them. The facts of ethnology, history, and psychology do not appear to substantiate such a hope. Collective behaviors, such as Mr. Dewey has envisaged for the ideal democratic state, is not characteristic of actual group thought and action, either past or present. Surtier, in a valuable study, has shown that only the rare, heroic individual rises above the level of what he terms, quote, inferior forms of explanation, end quote. By the same token, we may expect that if there is ever any development of really humane social institutions, this will occur only when the impulses of a people are rendered articulate and given direction by superior, dominant individuals. We may expect further that a scheme of things in which geniuses are identified with freaks, which depend upon the expression of a magic collective intelligence for its ideals and ideas, which proposes as a standard of social worth an esoteric equality of individuals as opposed to a concrete criterion of social conduct, will undoubtedly find itself impotent to descend from the level of pure abstraction on which it now reposes. If one derives any personal satisfaction from the belief in the metaphysical and moral equality of individuals, there is perhaps no harm in harboring it. Americans, however, should find it difficult to expect that an effective moral order will originate in a recondite communism of spirit in a people without leaders. We have been operating on some such basis for a number of years, and if ever a nation needed geniuses, heroes, or divine leaders, it is America now. A third important point raised by Mr. Dewey in his discussions of the advantages of the communistic order is that concerning the extent to which association among individuals would be promoted by it. He holds that the industrial corporate order tends to make for an aggregate mental and emotional life, to promote human association, and thus to enhance the, quote, liberation of capacity, which is the all-important function of education. It seems to me that two entirely different and even opposed conditions are confused here. The only association or communication of any psychological import is that of face-to-face interaction among individuals, and it appears that instead of more association of this sort in the corporate age, there is actually less of it. We do indeed have greater similarity in the behavior patterns of individuals, more people doing the same thing in the same way and perhaps at the same time, but this by no means ensures real communion. The fact that, along with 10 million other persons, a man eats potato chips made in Detroit is of about zero order of significance as far as the humanizing process of liberation of spirit in social interaction goes. The 2,000 patrons of a modern movie palace engage in no real communication or interaction, and consequently could scarcely be said to participate in an aggregate emotional life or to be sharing experiences in a manner calculated to produce development of personality. The performance of a train of activities along the same external pattern as that followed by millions of other people means no corresponding psychological communism. This real association exists for the generality of people only in the agrarian community and in the villages and towns which are its adjuncts. It depends upon a stable population, upon long acquaintances, since human beings do not bear spigots by which fraternity can be drawn off for the asking. The city necessarily means a diminution of these associations. The casual, fleeting, formal contacts with great numbers of people only enhance a sense of isolation, and consequently inhibit the very process of liberation of spirit, which Mr. Dewey rightly regards as of great importance in mental development. Another phase of the same problem is the decline of the family. This is perhaps much more important than any other phase of contemporary disintegration, since the family is the natural biological group, the normal milieu of shared experiences, community of interests, integration of personality. The segmentation of both adult and child activities, which has accompanied the corporate age, leaves little to the family beyond the details of finance and the primary sexual functions. Allport has recently pointed out in an excellent article that the moral and educational functions of the family are more and more entrusted to depersonalized external agencies, which simulate the form of familial function, but which are entirely devoid of its content. The following quotation summarizes the psychological importance of the family very well. Quote, in youth as in age, in work as in play, in physical care as in education and morals, there remains a vital function which only such a face-to-face relation as the biological family can fulfill. No artifice of the social scientist, no new marriage contract or community agency can replace this relationship as a medium for the development and integration of human personality. Fresh expectancies of conduct may be defined, new organizations may spring up to take over old familial duties, but these devices only dissipate our energies the further and realign us among new factions and patterns. The only reality which is ultimately worth considering is that of human beings which associate together, and the life of the family is the life which actual fathers, mothers, and children live in one another's company. Unless there are opportunities for individuals to grow and to realize their potentialities through free contact with one another, the most highly perfected pattern of the sociologist will be only an empty formula. End of quote. We have of late been deluged with psychoanalytic literature on the abnormal influence of parents upon children. Dire pictures of sex attachments and conflicts within the family have driven some of these hardy souls to urge that the institution be scrapped. There is, of course, some basis for their claims, but the percentage of abnormalities resulting from familial association is negligible in comparison with the benefits for people generally. And these benefits we are fast surrendering to the industrial order, whose patterns of conduct are incompatible with the conditions necessary to the stability and integrity of family life. The sequel of industrialism is, then, personal isolation and a fractionation of life functions into an ever-expanding and differentiating system of formalized institutions. How can the individual re-find himself, to use Mr. Dewey's term, when all of the dominant tendencies of the age are trying to lose him? Both in the economic and in the psychological sense, we observe that the theory and the practice of the corporate industrial regime diverge widely. It should be productive, we are told, of greater sharing of goods and of experiences, of an economic and psychological communism, which the, quote, mighty upward trend toward democracy, end quote, presumably has had for its goal. Actually, the conditions of life since the Industrial Revolution have been favoring greater exploitation in the economic sense and less psychological association of the sort essential to personality development. In view of these considerations, one wonders if industrialism is the inevitable destiny of Western civilization. By industrialism is meant not the machine and industrial technology as such, but the domination of the economic, political, and social order by the notion that the greater part of a nation's energies should be directed toward an endless process of increasing the production and consumption of goods. There is nothing inherently evil about a machine, although the operation of one on a lifetime scale would necessarily be pretty monotonous. I have spent many months in a large tire factory operating a machine for which I could never form any emotional attachment, in spite of Mr. Dewey's suggestion that modification might be introduced in the ownership of machines of such a nature that feeling and emotion might enter into the tasks of daily life. It is not the machine, however, but the theory of the use of the machine to which I object. And if this theory, which we may call industrialism, is a valid hypothesis of the course of Western civilization, all discussion of progress would do well to cease. The only intelligible meaning of progress implies social institutions for producing psychological effects, just the reverse of those so outstanding in our machine age. The question asked above, relative to industrialism in the future, must then be answered before any discussion as to the possibility of progress can be reached. We shall now consider briefly a few important aspects of the industrial situation by way of trying to answer this question. One outstanding fact in industry at present is that with the great increase in production and in new commodities, and with consumption coerced to the limit, there is a steady decrease in employment. Improvements in technology, as Mr. Stuart Chase has recently pointed out, quote, can mean only one thing. An equivalent tonnage of goods can be produced by a declining number of workers, and men must lose their jobs by the thousands, presently by the millions. End of quote. The so-called blotting paper trades, which hitherto have absorbed many of these workers, but not all, are very soggy, thinks Mr. Chase. This seems only logical. There must be a saturation point somewhere in the consumption process, and we would seem to be approaching it. Chronic unemployment of some 2 million out of 30 million workers in the country, with the figure rising to 4 million or more in times of cyclical depression, such as the present, cannot be wiped out by charity, slogans, Hoover conferences which recommend increased buying, or increases in the tariff. Hungry and maladjusted men, women, and children, in numbers that bid fair to increase, is one of the promises of industrialism for the future. With the curve of employment running steadily downward, industry will be increasingly unable to maintain the present army of workers permanently and continuously. The logical outcome of these conditions is growing internal dissension and eventually revolution. This result will be greatly facilitated by the instability of a floating populace concentrated in large urban industrial centers, unattached to that tremendous social anchor, land, and lacking in, quote, solid and assured objects of belief and approved ends of action, end of quote. Mr. William Green recently warned a Senate committee that the labor forces under his direction could not be held in line much longer unless drastic measures were taken to relieve the unemployment situation. The latter is, of course, only an aspect of the general problem of industrialism, and it is possible to alleviate the condition temporarily without removing its cause. Another world war, which the international struggle for markets suggests as not an unlikely prospect, would afford temporary relief. Mr. Owen Young is quoted in press dispatches as saying that overproduction with the consequent competition for foreign markets is a real menace to international peace. There is nothing very strange in this idea, inasmuch as we are now far enough away from the last war to understand the economic translation of making the world safe for democracy. Another salvation drama would relieve the labor market and take care of the surplus for a while, but this is neither a permanent nor a very intelligent solution. The institution of various palliative measures by industrialists themselves may also serve to postpone the hour of reckoning. Among these are unemployment insurance, state unemployment compensation, the shortening of working hours with the consequent employment of more men, regularization of production, increase in the age limit of child laborers, and so on. These measures would undoubtedly